the Bible is the only book we need to find salvation in Christ and live a Christian life, but it's not the only book that's out there. God does speak to us in other ways, and I want my readers to be able to access this goodness, truth, and beauty. Thank God, as believers, we have the measuring rod. We have the Bible. We have Christ. But as long as we have that measure, we can open up our arms and look for goodness, truth, and beauty in every place, and it can strengthen us. Thus, as the ancient Hebrews did, shall we despoil the Egyptians. That's the image they always used to use when God told the Jews, go to your neighbors and say, give me some gold. And thus they despoiled. Or so we can be like Moses, who was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, or like Daniel, who was trained in all the wisdom of the Babylonians and the Persians, right? So that we can access this goodness and learn and therefore become stronger people, and I think better Christians.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Markos, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes. Lewis, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, Lewis, this is the very first time you and I are meeting. I know you are going to be brand new to a bunch of my listeners, so let's kick off our conversation by having you share a bit of the Markos origin story. For those encountering you for the first time in our talk today, what do they need to know about you?
Well, it's Lou Markos with a K because I'm Greek. All four of my grandparents were actually born in Greece, came to America about the 1930s. So I actually am Greek, grew up, I only know a little Greeklish, like people that speak half Spanish and half English. But I've got that deep, rich Greek background. I actually grew up and was saved in the Orthodox Church, but then during college and a varsity Christian fellowship, the Lord moved me into the evangelical world. But it's been great because it's allowed me to sort of talk to people from all different denominations. One of my big specialties is C.S. Lewis, the great mere Christianity guy. And so my heart has always been, let's get to the essential beliefs of Christianity that we all share, and let's learn from one another. Now, my PhD is from the University of Michigan. My specialty were the Romantic and Victorian poets. That would be Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning. And that's my specialty, and I've written on that. But C.S. Lewis has taught me how important it is not just to be a specialist, but to be a generalist. And so I also teach and speak and write on anything having to do with ancient Greece or ancient Rome. I speak a lot on Dante. I also write and speak on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, particularly Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. And also one of my passions is apologetics, and not just what we think of as rational apologetics, the science arguments, intelligent design. I talk about that, but I also believe in what's called cultural apologetics. And what that means, Shaun, is that I do want to appeal to the mind. I want to show people that Christianity is logical and coherent and systematic, but I also want to appeal, as C.S. Lewis did, to the imagination, to show that, hey, Christianity is not only the truth, but it tells the best story out there. That you've heard that buzzword meta-narrative. That's the overarching narrative that all other narratives point to. And Christianity is the greatest story ever told. And we may talk about this later, but I really believe if we're going to reach this generation, we have got to have a theology that is not just systematic, but that's narrative. We have to give them a story and show them that this is the story that God's telling and that we're actually part of that story. So something like Myth Made Fact is just coming out of my sort of interdisciplinary heart, bringing together philosophy and theology and the imagination and the arts and all of that together in one package, because Christianity has something to say about all of those things and all of those things together.
And Lewis, in terms of that intersection between mythology and Christianity, what sparked a desire to study that? Was it a book? Was it a professor? Where did that fascination begin?
I really think more than anything, it was C.S. Lewis. And I tell a story in the book, and I'll tell it now because one of the things that brought C.S. Lewis to faith was exactly that intersection between mythology and Christianity. Shaun, I'm sure that almost all your listeners know that C.S. Lewis was an atheist for a long time before he became a Christian. That's one of the reasons he's such a great apologist. He speaks to the person he used to be, right? But a lot of people just take for granted that C.S. Lewis went directly from being an atheist to being a Christian, which is the story for Lee Strobel and Chuck Colson and Josh McDowell. A lot of the great American apologists had that experience of going from atheism to Christianity. But Lewis had an intermediate step. First, when he was about 30, 31 years old, he became a theist. In other words, he came to believe in God. But he still found himself unable to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So what was holding him back? Well, C.S. Lewis was an English professor like I am myself, and like me, he loved mythology, he loved legends, he studied that. He read a book called The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer. He was the sort of Joseph Campbell of his day, a comparative anthropologist, a comparative mythologist, and he looked at all the different, ancient people groups and their myths and their legends and whatnot. And this guy, Frazer, had identified an archetype. That's a recurring theme or character that appears across cultures and across times. And this archetype, we call it the Corn King, because there's so many stories in ancient mythology of a sort of son of the gods who comes to earth and dies, and then in a way is reborn. Not exactly like the resurrection, but a sort of seasonal myth of life and death and rebirth. And it just seemed to run throughout the ancient world. If you're a Greek, you call him Osiris, or you call him Adonis. If you're an Egyptian, you call the Corn King Osiris. Right? If you are a Babylonian, you call him Tammuz. If you're Persian, you call him Mithras. If you're a Norseman, you call him Balder, right? So this same thing appears everywhere. And C.S. Lewis just took for granted that, well, this Jesus of Nazareth guy, he's just the Corn King of the Hebrews. So why do I care? What do I care about a rabbi that died 2,000 years ago? And then one day, when Lewis was 32 years old, he was taking a walk with his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, strong believing Catholic. And he said, Jack, that was Lewis's nickname, he said, Jack, did you ever consider maybe the reason that Jesus sounds like a myth is because he's the myth that became fact? Think about it, Shaun. If we are all indeed created in the image of the same God, then that God has put in all of us that desire for this story, this desire for a God to come to earth, an understanding that we are broken in some way, and that brokenness needs to be fixed, and there needs to be life and death and rebirth. And so it makes sense that the only understanding that all of us have this is because it was put there by the same God. Well, then if that God actually comes into history and affects our salvation, I mean, yes, as Christians, we know that when Jesus did that, he fulfilled all of the Old Testament law and prophets, all those prophets, Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, and all these wonderful, wonderful prophecies. And he fulfilled the law, and he fulfilled Leviticus, all of that stuff. But what Lewis understood, and what I understand it, is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that when Jesus came and died and rose again, he did not only fulfill the Old Testament law and prophets, he fulfilled all the highest yearnings of the pagan people. Because, Shaun, it's not like God completely ignored 99% of humanity until Jesus came along, right? Only to the Jews did he speak directly. That's what we call special revelation. But he didn't ignore the pagans, the Gentiles. He spoke to them, but through what theologians call general revelation, through their conscience, through creation, and yes, through their dreams, through their myths, through their legends and stories. And so when we study mythology and these strange and sometimes terrifying stories, what we're seeing is man yearning for God. Now, in Jesus, that's God reaching out to man and actually affecting our salvation. But I hope that when God works out our salvation, it will fulfill all of our yearnings. And so that's why the book is called The Myth Made Fact, because that's the phrase that Tolkien said to Lewis that revolutionized everything and changed him. And suddenly, it wasn't Christianity against mythology. It was the greatest mythology is pointing to the full revelation of Christ.
Well, Lewis, I really like that you're pulling on that innate, built-in desire of man throughout all of history to connect with God, to understand God. It is helpful to really press into that. What we see in mythology was people throughout the ages trying to work out the relationship of man to God and how that plays out in their worldview as they best understood. Just fascinating to start thinking down that path. In terms of Lewis, obviously he's one of many Christian thinkers throughout history who've compared biblical figures and teachings to various myths. Who are some of the other voices that have spoken into this in past years? And then what are some of the key comparisons that have been made?
Wow. Now, of course, Lewis is the center. The other one is J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, Lord of the Rings is, if you will, a little more subtle than the Chronicles of Narnia. But if anybody gets a chance to read something he wrote called On Fairy Stories, that's where he works out this idea of the story. And he even coined this beautiful phrase, a eucatastrophe. That's EU and then the word catastrophe. Because EU in Greek, like eugenics or euphonious, that means good. And of course, catastrophe is a downturn. So the eucatastrophe is the good catastrophe. It's when you think everything's gone and destroyed, and suddenly there's this uplift, there's this hope that points past the world. And it's very similar to what the medievals called felix culpa. That's the happy fall, right? And the eucatastrophe would be the fall of man. That's the worst thing that ever happened. But even though it's terrible in and of itself, the fall is good because it led to the coming of Christ into the world. The crucifixion happened on a day we call Good Friday. Shaun, have we lost our mind? Good Friday, the worst day in human history? And yet, it's good because it points forward to the resurrection. So Lewis and Tolkien both Lewis and Tolkien were influenced by a man named G.K. Chesterton. And if your listeners haven't read him, read Orthodoxy and The Everlasting Man. They had a profound influence on Lewis. But if we want to go farther back, we've got a man named Cardinal Newman. He was a British Victorian writer who actually converted to Catholicism and became a cardinal. And he is one of the architects in some ways of classical Christian education. He believed that, again, we could learn things of lasting goodness, truth, and beauty from the ancient pagan writers, from the Greeks and the Romans, also the Norsemen, but particularly the Greeks and the Romans. Before that, there was Milton. Now, Milton is that great Puritan revolutionary, right? So we might think that he would be no paganism, but no. Milton brings together the whole classical and Judeo-Christian tradition in his, famous Paradise Lost. And Milton wrote a famous essay called Areopagitica, and it's one of the most famous defenses of the freedom of the press. And one of the reasons he said we needed freedom of the press is an amazing argument, Shaun. He said that the fruit we tasted was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And he said part of the curse of the fruit is that now in our fallen world, good and evil are so entwined that sometimes the only way to get to the good is through the evil. Now, Milton wasn't saying go sleep around. It wasn't that kind of stuff. But what he's saying is everything mixed together now. There's truth, but sometimes that truth is hiding under some falsehoods. And of course, there are a lot of falsehoods in Greek mythology as well. Before Milton, we have Dante, who wrote the great Divine Comedy, which, like Paradise Lost, which is later, draws together the entire Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian tradition together. We see it in Augustine as well, the way Augustine was able to learn so much from Plato, and yet he was able to take some of the truth that was in Plato and take it up into the fullness of truth. And by the way, Aquinas did the same thing for Aristotle. So I talk a lot about Platonic myths in my book, and Plato's the one who came up with the idea of the forms, right? That in our earth, there's all different kinds of trees, but up in the heavens is the tree with a capital T, the essence of treeness. Up there are the capital letters, goodness with a capital G, beauty with a capital B, justice with a capital J. And what was Augustine to do with that? I mean, he didn't literally believe there were forms in the heavens, but what Augustine did is he took the forms of Plato and put them in the mind of God, because the essence and origin of everything is ultimately in the mind of God. So again, there have been a lot of great thinkers out there that are making these connections, and I quote from a lot of them in my book as well. So it's a long-standing way of finding a link. And I'll tell you, Shaun, the most important Bible passage for anyone that really wants to bring together the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman, what we call bringing together Athens and Jerusalem, is the famous speech that St. Paul gave in Athens, right? He went to the Agora, the marketplace in Athens, and he looked around and he saw that there were idols to everything. He even saw an idol to an unknown God. And when he saw that, Paul said, I'm glad I listened to Markos's interview. Now I know what to do, right? And so Paul went up to the Areopagus where the people met. It used to be a governing body. By this time, it was Stoics and Epicureans, college elite that wanted to listen to new ideas and decide whether or not to allow them into the city-state, the polis of Athens. And so they allowed Paul to speak. And Paul looked at them and said, "Men of Athens," which is how Socrates would always begin his speeches, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are a religious people, for I see you have a temple." He doesn't say idol, he's building a bridge here. "I see you have a temple to every god. I even see you have a temple to an unknown God." And then he says the words that I believe, particularly as a Greek, that I believe the ancient Greco-Roman world was waiting to hear. He said, "Now, therefore, what you have worshipped in ignorance, I will proclaim as true." And he went on to tell them that the Lord God does not dwell in temples made by human hands, but out of one man he created all races of men. He set their time and spaces so that they might grope after him and reach after him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As your own poets, your own pagan poets have said, we are his offspring. And a lot of people don't realize that Paul is quoting two different pagan poets. One pagan poet named Epimenides, he's the one who said, "In him we live and move and have our being." And another one named Aratus said, "We are his offspring." And the he in both of those poems is Zeus. But what Paul is saying is, without them knowing it, they were pointing not to Zeus, but to the true God, the God who does not dwell in temples made by human hands. So anybody that wants to build that bridge has to look back to that all-important story, because there Paul is being our first cultural anthropologist. He's saying, look, your own poets have yearned from this and pointed to this. Follow me and I'll take you to the fullness of truth. And that's sort of what I'm doing in this book. I'm drawing out, deeper meanings and deeper truths that maybe the pagan writers didn't even know they were doing, right? But they yearned for. God has written eternity on the hearts of men, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And again, sometimes the things that speak to us at the deepest level are the myths, the legends, the great stories. Don't the great stories never end? That's what Sam says to Frodo in Lord of the Rings. And we are part of that ongoing story.
Well, Lewis, in the book, you retell 50 different myths. And I think for this next part of the interview, I'd love to have you share a couple of your favorites with us. Tell us a little bit of the story, the context, and what are some of the things you draw out in each of those particular chapters?
Well, Shaun, I'm looking at the cover right now, and they really came up with a wonderful dramatic cover of poor Icarus. And that's the first myth that I tell, and it's probably the best known. Daedalus was the great artificer, the first person to invent machines, if you will. He's the one that architected the labyrinth to put the evil Minotaur in. But after he created the labyrinth, the evil King Minos imprisoned him in his own labyrinth so nobody would know the secret. But he wanted to escape, and he was in the labyrinth with his son, Icarus, Daedalus and Icarus, father and son. And there was a window that they could escape from, but that window overlooked a sheer drop right down to the sea. So the only way they could escape was by flying. But we don't have wings. And so he studied the birds, and he built a wooden frame, and he collected the feathers, and he attached the feathers to the frame with wax and made wings, right? And he put the wings on himself and on his son Icarus, and he instructed him, son, when we leave, Do not fly too close to the ocean, or the water will make your wings heavy and drag you down. But also don't fly too high, or the sun will melt the wax and the feathers will fall. And Icarus agrees, but once they get there on the breeze and they're flying like birds, Icarus forgets the good advice his father gave him. He flies too low, his wings get heavier and heavier, and then in the last second he stretches out his wings and he soars, but he keeps going higher and higher and higher till he gets closer to the sun, and the sun melts the wax, the feathers fall off, and he plunges to his death, right? And we see here the importance of taking a middle course, the importance of listening to good advice, proverbial advice. And we need to, even Aristotle, the great pagan philosopher, knew that virtue was the mean between the extremes. Don't soar too low, don't soar too high, keep focused. Also, at an even deeper level, Shaun, a lot of times, God lays down laws for us. And some of those laws are don't do this. And too often, even as Christians, we have this idea that God is saying, don't do this because he doesn't want us to have fun. You've heard that old adage, why is it everything I want to do is either illegal, immoral, or fattening, right? Well, this is not the God we serve. He gives us these laws to protect us, not to put us in a cage, but to protect us from destroying each other. I think sometimes we have this idea that God gave the law to the Jews to turn them into slaves. It's completely the opposite. The Jews were former slaves who were moving into freedom, but if God had not given them the law, they would have just ended up putting themselves back in slavery. Unless we're morally self-regulating, we're just going to enslave ourselves. And this is kind of scary in our country. As we cease to be morally self-regulating, you see what's going on. And what I'm getting at is that the Daedalus and Icarus story points forward to a truth that is truly true, that even reflects a biblical understanding of the father heart of God. Well, let's go to the opposite extreme. Most of the things I tell are just straight myths, fairy tales, you might call them. But I also tell a bunch of myths that are retold in famous Greek tragedies, like the Oedipus and the Antigone and the Agamemnon. All these are the Medea stories about Jason and Theseus and things like that. And one of the ones that people still tend to read in high school is the famous play Antigone. Right now, Antigone had two brothers named Eteocles and Polynices, and they were supposed to rule the city of Thebes jointly. So Eteocles would rule for 1 year, then he would give it to his brother and go back and forth. But after his first year of rule, Eteocles refused to turn over the reins to his brother Polynices. And so in anger, Polynices raised up an army and attacked Thebes. And during the sort of civil war that broke out, the two brothers ended up killing each other. And their uncle, his name was Creon, becomes the new king. And the new king is an absolute law and order man, no idea of mercy. He says the only way to have civil justice here and restore order is Eteocles. I'm going to give him a huge public lavish funeral, but Polynices, who's the one who attacked the city, I'm going to take his body and throw it to the dogs, and I'm going to decree that anybody who tries to give him a proper burial will be put to death. And in ancient Greece, if you don't get a proper burial, you're sort of wandering around. You'll never find peace. Well, in steps the sister Antigone. And Antigone is not sort of naturally a rebel, but this is her brother, and she is not going to allow her brother, rebel or not, she's not going to allow her brother to, body to rot. That's just violates every moral and ethical law. And so she goes ahead and does the burial, and her uncle catches her and eventually puts her to death. But at the heart of the play is this dialogue between the two, between Creon and Antigone. And Creon says, you need to follow the law. And Antigone says, there is a higher law, a law of piety that is higher than your man-made civic laws, and it says that it's wrong to leave a dead body to rot. Okay, there's a lot more to the story, but the reason I spent a little time telling this is C.S. Lewis, one of the great arguments he argued for the existence of God is that if you really, really study all the ancient books and study people, you will realize that all of us no matter our culture or religion, have a basic sense of the law written in our conscience. It's universal. And he called this the Tao, T-A-O, purposely using an Asian word to show that basic morality is ubiquitous because it was put in our conscience by God. Now, of course, the reason we need Christianity is because we can't follow the law, and we never do, and we need a solution outside the law, the grace of Christ in the death and resurrection. But the fact that we all have this understanding of morality sort of disproves evolution. If we all simply evolved out of survival of the fittest, then what is the origin of this universal moral ethical law code? Well, to me, Antigone the play is one of the proofs that this law actually exists, because the play would not make sense unless Creon himself knew that ultimately Antigone was right, that there is a higher law. But he refused it. That's what the tragedy is. But it's more than that, Shaun. The only way that the audience of this tragedy, because this was a tragedy performed in ancient Greece, 5th century BC, the only way the audience would understand and be moved by this play is if they too knew at some deep level that we all have a Tao, right there. So what I'm getting at is these myths, these stories, these legends embody for us human urges and yearning and understanding. And we can, and again, a lot of times we can learn much more about a people. See, I mean, I love archaeology; it's great, but the stones and the buildings can only tell us so much. When we look at their art, when we look at their literature, we're getting to the soul of people. And what Antigone's telling us is that people understand there is a Tao, that there is a moral dilemma, and that there's something that transcends the man-made laws of the state.
Well, Lewis, let's have you dig into one more myth before we move on. What can we learn from Pandora's Box?
Oh, that's a good one. And I'm glad you chose that because it's so well known, right? And it's an amazing story because it sounds a little bit like the story of Eve. Now, Pandora is a Greek word that means all the gifts. She was the first woman ever created, and the gods all gave her separate gifts. So she had beauty, and she had talent, and she had intelligence, and crafts, all these things she had. And she was sent to the earth and married off to the brother of Prometheus. Prometheus means forethought. His brother Epimetheus means afterthought. And he's the one that took in Pandora. But when they sent Pandora down, they gave her a box. And they told her, whatever you do not open up this box. Right? And for the first year of marriage, she was fine. But then curiosity took over. Curiosity killed the cat, as we say. And out of curiosity, she thought, well, let me just peek in the box. And she just opens it a crack, and immediately the box flies open, and out of the box come all the evils: sickness, despair, war, pestilence, lies, murder. All of these evil things come flying out of the box. And Pandora, oh, no. And she closes the lid. But it's already escaped. And then she listens, and she hears a little voice coming from the box. Let me out, Pandora. And she, who are you? And the voice says, I'm Hope. And she opens up the box, and out comes Hope. Right? So all the evils are in the world because of, let's put it in sort of Augustinian terms, because of a misuse of human free will. She ushered in all of the despair. It's amazing that the pagans understood this. They didn't know the story of Adam and Eve, the ones who invented these myths, but they understood that there's a brokenness in this world. And I think they understood that ultimately it was our own disobedience and bad choices. But hope is still there. And what I love about the story, right, is if you look at Genesis 3, we fall. But immediately after we fall, God gives us some hope. That beautiful, beautiful verse. When God says, it might have even been Jesus, I'm not sure which of the Trinity, but when God says, I will put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, right? And the seed of the serpent will bite his heel, but he will crush his head. And theologians call this a proto-evangelium. In other words, the very first gospel or good news, because thousands of years later, Satan would get Jesus by getting us to crucify him. He would, in that sense, bite him on the heel. But after the crucifixion came the resurrection, and Jesus crushed the head of the serpent, which is Satan. So in the Pandora story, we not only have the story of Eve, we also have that fate, hope. Now, in Greek mythology, that hope is very, very insubstantial, but it still points forward to the real and substantial hope, the hope that became flesh in Christ.
Well, Lewis, I wanted to have you speak to something else that I actually highlighted in my notes, and it was this idea that you shared early on in the book that we would have been better off if our secular schools had simply jettisoned their attempt to teach virtue altogether. Talk to us a little bit about that, and how has that impacted our culture?
I will tell you, Shaun, I used to think, I speak for a lot of classical Christian schools, a lot of homeschoolers. I love those people. And Shaun, I'm more optimistic than most Christians because I've spoken all over the country at these schools and at everyone, and at their conferences too. And every school has the same spirit. There is a love of the Lord. There's a love of learning, a love of this country. We are not beaten, Shaun. Okay, we got to stop listening to the media making us believe that we're a post-Christian nation. Maybe Europe is post-Christian, but we're not. The light, the salt and the light is everywhere. Now, I love these schools. Both of my kids are now teaching at classical schools, actually. They're mid-20s, and they're both teaching at classical schools. And I used to try to, what's wrong with the public schools? And at first I thought that the problem was that the public schools had thrown out virtue. And I really believed that until I looked more carefully. And I realized that that's not the problem. The problem is not that they threw out virtue, it's that they took the real virtues and substituted them with pseudo-virtues, what they call values. There are virtues taught in our school, but as far as I can tell, there's only 5 of them. Multiculturalism, egalitarianism, tolerance, environmentalism. These are all these isms. And I'm not saying tolerance is a bad thing. It's good to be tolerant. But this is not the center of virtue and has never been. Right? For instance, what tolerance should mean is we must respect all people because we are all made in the image of God. But that's not what they mean by tolerance. What they mean by tolerance is, hey, I'll overlook your sin if you overlook my sin. Right? Environmentalism, if what they meant by that was a stewardship, right? Being a steward of creation, as Adam and Eve were meant to be, that's fine, but that's not what they mean. Environmentalism basically means that man is bad and nature is good. It's almost a kind of idolatry. And so what I'm getting at, Shaun, is if they had just really thrown out virtue, then the students would have been hungry for it and looked for real virtues. But unfortunately, what they do is they take the natural yearning God gave us and they fill it full of phony things, so that we are literally creating a generation where a young man might say, well, yes, I do sleep around, but it's okay. I recycle cans. And I'm serious. People actually feel like they're moral when they're tolerant, even if what they're tolerating is incredibly immoral. Right? And so these pseudo things, they fill up. It's sort of like junk food. It fills up your yearning without really satisfying it. And I've always believed, the football coaches say the best defense is a strong offense, right? And so what I try to do in this book, but in a lot of other works that I write as well, I want to bring back real virtue. That's justice, courage, temperance, justice, these things, wisdom, faith, hope, love. Let's bring back the real virtues and make those so appealing that they'll lose their interest in the phony virtues. The best way to get rid of weeds in your lawn is not to cover your lawn with weed killer. The best way to get rid of weeds is to grow very, very healthy grass. If the grass is super healthy, the weeds simply will not grow up in it. And so we need to excite a young generation with real virtues, get them excited about them. And you know what? The best way to do that is through story, through fairy tales. How have we taught the importance of honesty to students in America for hundreds of years? By telling them the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Now, most historians say, oh, that's not true. But it doesn't make a difference. That is a myth or a legend. Just like what's the other story? When I was a kid, apparently Abraham Lincoln ran like 5 miles to get a hold of somebody to give him back the 2 pennies of change that he forgot to give him. Right? This idea of honesty, we used to treasure that, and so we passed it along through story. Shaun, do you remember a book called The Book of Virtues by William Bennett?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that?
Yep.
Great book. The funny thing about that book is if that book had been published 100 years ago, people would have said, duh. I mean, of course that's what we do. But that book was a sensation, thank God it was, because we'd forgotten what all the generations before us knew, that we learn and grow by reading stories and modeling ourselves, both modeling ourselves after the heroes and avoiding the vices of the villains. And when they start stealing our fairy tales and twisting them, I mean, yes, Shrek is very funny, but I also don't like Shrek. I don't like the way we've been taking good fairy tales and twisting them because it sends a very bad message to young people. You need to give them stories that they can live by and that they will live up to.
Yeah, it has been really fascinating to see how stories have been retold, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, where something that would have been historically been portrayed as evil is now good, and what would have been traditionally portrayed as good somehow in the story becomes evil. Things definitely seem flip-flopped and upside down.
Yeah, and people just don't understand how dangerous that is. If we raise up a generation on these sort of fractured and perverted fairy tales, we're actually courting disaster. What are we doing? C.S. Lewis is one of the first people to notice this, that after the French Revolution, now I love the Romantic poets, and there's a lot of good stuff in them, but there's some dark side too. And after the French Revolution, they went back and they reread Paradise Lost by Milton, and they decided, wait a minute, the real hero here is Satan. Why? Because Satan was the rebel. He's the one that had energy. He's the one that shattered every boundary, that went against that cold, self-satisfied, smug Jehovah. And they started reading it that way. And that's one of the reasons Lewis wrote a book called A Preface to Paradise Lost, one of his best academic works, to say, no, I mean, the only way you can say that is if you've lost what he calls the stock response to treachery, that Satan is a traitor, and traitors are evil. And we have to be careful that we don't turn him into some kind of hero. I mean, one of the things, I mean, you know, we all have to make our own decisions, but the one kind of movie I refuse to watch these days are serial killer movies. I'm just tired of this heroizing of serial killers. Why are we fascinated by twisted serial killers? And yet more and more every time I turn around, that's at the center of things. And so we need to be careful what we are passing down to our children, what the stories are that we're telling.
Well, Lewis, we've talked a lot about stories told in text, but before we go, I want to make sure we give you a little bit of time to talk about art based on mythology, and how does some of that art actually point us towards Christ, point us towards God?
It's so great. You know, I'm so thankful for Classical Academic Press. They've just gone whole hog on this book. They've made it twice as long as it was originally and added all this art. I also teach film classes, and I've taught a few art classes too. And I put together a bunch of PowerPoints of classical art. I mean, people like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Titian, Caravaggio, Rembrandt, a lot of these famous names. Until the very recent period, Shaun, most of the great art of the Renaissance, the Baroque period, the Neoclassical period, most of the greatest art was based on one of two things, and I've taught classes of both. One is Bible stories, Old and New Testament, but the other is Greek mythology. And artists have always been drawn to Greek mythology, as have movies and music as well, because the myths get down to the essence. The myths take us to the big questions. You know, who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? What is the nature of goodness, truth, and beauty? What is the nature of the good state, the good life, the good man? All of these questions are asked in a story, in a narrative. So it's not overly didactic. It's not a sermon. It's more like the question has been incarnated. And a lot of artists of all kinds, like I said, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, a work of classical music, or a film, or a play, it's being inspired. And what people need to understand about Greek mythology is that it's not like the Bible, okay? Greek mythology is full of contradictions. Why? Because the Greek mythology is the raw material, and different artists use it in different ways to capture and put forward their theme or their idea, what they're trying to convey. So just a quick example of that. What's the story everybody knows about Achilles, right? That when he was born, his mother Thetis, who was a goddess, dipped him in the river Styx, making his skin impervious, but because she held him by the heel, no water got on the heel, and that became his weak spot, what we call the Achilles heel, and he was killed, so mythology says, when Paris shot a poisoned arrow into his heel. Well, guess what? The only ancient myth we have that really, really deals with Achilles in a full way is the Iliad. And Homer, although he knew the myth, does not tell it, because he wants us to understand that the reason Achilles is the greatest warrior of all time is not because of some trick of impervious skin, but because he's simply the greatest warrior that ever lived. So, like Helen of Troy, is Helen a horrible, harlot, or is she a poor victim that was destroyed by the goddess of love, Aphrodite? It depends on the poet and what the poet is trying to say. A good example of that would be King Arthur. If any of your fans like Arthuriana, everybody that deals with King Arthur makes slight changes, but they stay true to the basic story, but they change things to inflect whatever meaning they want. And so Greek mythology is a storehouse of raw material that can be molded in 1,000 different ways. And we need to know those stories because they're there at the basis of the stories we tell ourselves.
And Lewis, when readers get to the last page of the Myth Made Fact, how do you hope you've impacted them? How do you hope you've inspired them?
Wow. I hope to open up their eyes so they can understand, look, I'm a good evangelical. The Bible is the inspired and inerrant word of God, okay? Only the Bible is going to give us, absolute knowledge, and only the Bible gives us the absolute touchstone against which we measure each other. But there's other things out there. Yes, the Bible is the only book we need to find salvation in Christ and live a Christian life, but it's not the only book that's out there. God does speak to us in other ways, and I want my readers to be able to access this goodness, truth, and beauty. Thank God as believers we have the measuring rod, we have the Bible, we have Christ. But as long as we have that measure, we can open up our arms and look for goodness, truth, and beauty in every place, and it can strengthen us. Thus, as the ancient Hebrews did, shall we despoil the Egyptians. That's the image they always used to use when God told the Jews, go to your neighbors and say, give me some gold. And thus they despoiled. Or so we can be like Moses, who was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, or like Daniel, who was trained in all the wisdom of the Babylonians and the Persians, right? So that we can access this goodness and learn and therefore become stronger people, and I think better Christians.
And I think the book all by itself would be an enjoyable read just for, you might say, the average man or woman on the street. I know it's also going to work well inside of a classroom, so what's your vision? How would you like to see this book put to use in the classroom?
It's great. I mean, they had me add to the book, and what I did in the book is I've got all these questions. So I've got study questions that can be used by teachers, but it can also be used by homeschooling parents. It can also be used by, let's say you have a small group Bible study and you want to find out what you can learn from Greek mythology. You also can use the book because all the questions and notes are there. But this is also a book that an individual can read. I would encourage people to read it devotionally. Read 1 or 2 stories at night before you go to bed or in the morning and reflect on them. And every chapter has the myth. And what I've done is I've retold the myth like an ancient storyteller. Right? Don't go looking them up on Wikipedia. You have to experience them as a story. So the first thing I do is tell the story as a storyteller. Then I have the full application, the sort of Christian reading of it. But then after I do that interpretation, then I've got all of those questions, all different ways to look at it. And I've also got lots and lots of notes in there that fit, and classic academics laid it out in the most beautiful fashion. You've got notes that not only give you more information about people and places and themes, but also lots and lots of Bible quotes. Okay, so you really can reflect biblically on each chapter because I've given you lots and lots of scriptures that tie in with the myth and give us a fuller perspective. So it's a wide. It makes great gifts. It can be used for middle school or high school. It can be used by teachers. So it's kind of a multifaceted book, and that's how we made it. So it's one size fits all in a way.
And Lewis, where should we go on the web to find out more about this book and all of the many other great resources you've released through the years?
The best thing is just go to Amazon.com and type in my name, Louis Markos, Markos with a K. This is book number, actually, when this is published, that'll be my 20th book. So there's lots of books. They're about literature, they're about apologetics, they're about Lewis and Tolkien, all different things. But really, the concept of the myth-made fact underlies most of what I write in one way or another. It's bringing Athens and Jerusalem together.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Louis and pick up your very own copy of this book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Louis Markos. Once again, our book today was The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. For more on Louis and his many books, a great place to start is Amazon, so head on over to his Amazon author page. And Louis, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor, it's been a joy to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it, and thanks for your ministry, Shaun. Keep up the good work.